She sat upon a throne of velvet and gold, a monarch whose appetites devoured far more than mere power, sending tremors through the courts of Europe. Her name, whispered in candlelit corridors, carried scandalous tales that made kings avert their eyes and priests tremble for the nation's soul. Wherever she went, reputations crumbled, alliances fell, and even the noblest hearts were torn to shreds by her insatiable hunger. This was the queen whose passions ruled her realm as fiercely as her scepter, and whose name would become a dark legend across a continent already choking on war and decadence. Our story begins in the mid-18th century, an age of enlightenment tangled in shadows, where reason and cruelty coexisted beneath silk and brocade. Monarchies ruled by divine right balanced precariously atop centuries of tradition, their royal courts bursting with intrigue, betrayal, and endless carnal games. This was a Europe where alliances were made in bedrooms as readily as on battlefields, where a careless rumor could bring down a dynasty, and where the nobility's vices were politely ignored until they threatened to infect the throne itself. Into this roiling cauldron of desire and deceit stepped a woman of staggering ambition, cunning, and beauty, Catherine of Russia, soon to be known by more scandalous titles than any queen before her. Catherine II, born Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, had not been destined for the throne of the greatest land empire on earth. Her early life was unremarkable by German princely standards. A minor aristocrat's daughter, raised in chilly Lutheran piety with a focus on obedience and self-control. Yet fate intervened when the Russian court, desperate to secure a German bride for the unstable heir apparent, Grand Duke Peter, extended its gaze to this clever, striking young woman. At just 14, Sophie traveled across the frostbitten frontiers into the glittering, dangerous embrace of St. Petersburg. There, she was reborn as Catherine, and so began a transformation that would shock the world. The Russia she entered was immense but fragile. Its emperors ruled over tens of millions with an iron will, yet lived in constant fear of coups and assassinations. The imperial court was a pit of vipers, where conspiracies slithered beneath layers of velvet ceremony. Peter III, her future husband, was a man unsuited for power by temperament and intellect. Awkward, resentful, and obsessed with toy soldiers, he inspired neither loyalty nor respect. As their marriage approached, Catherine quickly realized that survival, let alone success, required something more potent than a royal title. She would need to master the court's language of power, seduction, and merciless calculation. Catherine learned swiftly. Behind the frozen walls of the Winter Palace, she began to cultivate not just political alliances but a carefully curated mystique, wrapping herself in a charisma that made her rivals tremble. She read voraciously, studying philosophy and history, and even embraced Orthodox Christianity to win the hearts of the Russian people. Yet beneath this cultivated image, a deeper fire smoldered, a passion that would become the subject of gossip, envy, and horror for generations to come. Her husband, meanwhile, proved both unfaithful and incompetent, seeking solace with mistresses while neglecting his bride. Catherine, left isolated in a foreign land, surrounded by watchful spies and double-faced courtiers, turned inward and then outward to quench needs no one else dared acknowledge. From the early days of her reign, rumors spread of her unrestrained passions. She chose lovers without shame, rewarding them with titles, lands, and wealth in exchange for their devotion to her body and her cause. These men were tools as much as companions, each carefully selected to cement her grip on power, but also to satisfy the roaring hunger that seemed to burn away every trace of fear or guilt within her. Europe looked on in both fascination and disgust. A queen, with countless lovers paraded through her gilded bedchamber, seemed the ultimate scandal, the kind that confirmed every stereotype of barbarous, unrefined Russia. Pamphlets and tavern songs painted lurid pictures of Catherine's exploits, calling her a nymphomaniac, a she-wolf in a crown. They whispered that even horses might not be safe from her monstrous appetites, a grotesque rumor born of envy and fear rather than any real evidence. Still, the poison of such stories spread quickly, feeding the moral panic of kings and churchmen who saw in Catherine's behavior a threat to the entire moral order of Europe. But was Catherine truly the ravenous seductress that scandalmongers described? Or was she, in fact, a calculating sovereign who used every weapon at her disposal, including her sexuality, to protect herself and her empire from destruction? As Catherine's power grew, So did the stakes, and soon she would stand on the brink of a coup that would rewrite Russian history and cement her legacy as the greatest and most feared female ruler of her age. Before that revolution, however, she would be forced to navigate a labyrinth of betrayal, desire, and political murder that would test every ounce of her cunning. This was not merely the tale of a queen's lust, but the birth of a legend whose flame would burn across centuries. Catherine's rise to power was a spectacle of intrigue and audacity, and at the heart of it all lay her willingness to embrace both her own passions and the savage politics of the Russian court. Her legend was written not in fairy tales, but in blood, lust, and absolute will. And Europe, horrified yet hypnotized, would watch every step of her scandalous reign. Catherine's wedding to Peter III was the first stage of her transformation from a pliant princess into a figure of raw, undeniable force. Though outwardly she performed the role of a dutiful wife, inside she seethed with a resolve to seize her own destiny. Peter, cold and erratic, did nothing to inspire the confidence of Russia's nobles. He humiliated Catherine publicly, scorning her opinions, neglecting their bed, and flaunting his mistresses. He treated statecraft with the same childish enthusiasm he gave to his toy soldiers, and the courtiers soon realized that the empire might be doomed if left in his hands. Catherine, watching him with the patience of a hunter, saw her moment ripening like a poisoned fruit. The couple's relationship soon disintegrated. Peter became more openly hostile, convinced his wife plotted against him, and he was correct. Catherine, determined to survive in this world of shifting loyalties, began forging alliances in the shadows. She sought allies among the powerful Guards regiments, cultivating their officers with charm, political promises, and, as rumor insisted, with her own intoxicating affections. She needed their loyalty not only to shield her from her husband's anger, but to one day sweep him aside completely. Meanwhile, Catherine began to build a circle of lovers, men who served her physically and politically. They were hand-picked for their usefulness, their devotion, and their discretion. Grigory Orlov, a powerful Guards officer, became her most important partner in this conspiracy. Strong, passionate, and influential, Orlov was no mere bedwarmer. He was a soldier capable of rallying the might of the regiments to Catherine's cause. Their relationship blurred every boundary of propriety, combining sexual intoxication with ruthless political calculation. Together, they began to plan the unimaginable, a coup d'état to dethrone the Emperor of Russia. Peter, oblivious to the growing conspiracy, busied himself with alienating everyone who might have supported him. He insulted the Orthodox Church, abandoned Russian allies in favor of Prussia, and even hinted at replacing his wife once he consolidated his grip on power. These were fatal miscalculations. Catherine, meanwhile, played the role of the gracious, suffering wife with masterful skill, building sympathy among the aristocracy and the people, all while secretly preparing to strike. Then, in June 1762, the moment arrived. Peter departed from the capital for a brief holiday, leaving Catherine and her supporters in St. Petersburg. As the emperor relaxed at his country palace, Catherine moved with breathtaking speed. Her allies, many of them lovers past and present, rallied to her side. She slipped out of the palace under cover of night, dressed in the simple uniform of the Guards, and rode directly to their barracks. There, she proclaimed herself Empress of Russia, pledging to protect the nation from Peter's tyranny. The soldiers erupted in cheers, their loyalty assured by months of secret alliances, and Catherine's carefully woven spell of charisma and passion. By the time Peter realized what had happened, the capital had already declared for Catherine. Helpless, he attempted to flee, but was quickly captured. For a moment, Catherine hesitated. Could she really end the reign of her lawful husband so brutally? The stakes were too high for sentimentality. Peter was forced to abdicate, and within days, he was found dead under suspicious circumstances. Some whispered Catherine herself had ordered the murder to secure her throne, though she denied it to her dying day. The blood on her hands, if there was any, was washed away by the adulation of a grateful empire. The coup was a triumph. Catherine the Great, Empress of all the Russias, now sat upon the throne she had clawed from the jaws of fate, with the help of her lovers and her unmatched political instinct. But the same passions that had fueled her rise would become the greatest scandal of her reign. In the years that followed, Catherine would take lover after lover, a parade of handsome men who served her pleasures and, in many cases, her policies. Europe watched with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination as one young favorite replaced another, rewarded with titles and treasure as quickly as they were discarded. Gossip exploded. Chroniclers, foreign ambassadors, and domestic critics all scrambled to catalog her rumored excesses. They described orgies in gilded chambers, guards stripped to the waist to please the empress, wild parties lasting for days. In the salons of Paris and Vienna, Catherine was called the Messalina of the North, after Rome's most infamous nymphomaniac. Some even whispered that human lovers could not satisfy her, that she had turned to horses in unspeakable acts of depravity. These monstrous tales were surely false, born of envy and fear, yet they spread across Europe like wildfire, staining Catherine's name with an infamy that endures even to this day. Behind the rumors, however, stood a ruler of steel. Catherine modernized Russia with breathtaking ambition. She reorganized its laws, sponsored culture and science, and expanded its empire with a ruthless, almost masculine energy that terrified Europe's patriarchs. Her lovers were tools of statecraft, as much as they were companions, for Catherine believed that pleasure and power need not be separate. In that belief, she challenged everything the old world held sacred about female virtue, turning herself into an icon of unstoppable female will and a target for the most savage misogyny of her age. Even as her empire flourished, Catherine's bedchamber remained the subject of an almost pornographic obsession among Europe's elites. Pamphlets, poems, and caricatures were circulated showing the empress in various lurid poses, surrounded by groveling men, or worse. This narrative, the unstoppable nymphomaniac queen, threatened to overshadow her achievements. But Catherine, imperious and unstoppable, refused to bow to moral condemnation. She had seized an empire, and no rumor, however vile, could ever strip her of that triumph. Catherine's iron-fisted command over her public image and private empire did not come without cost. Behind the glittering balls and candlelit chambers lay a woman who was constantly calculating, constantly aware that every embrace, every indulgence, could one day be turned against her. Her lovers were tested, groomed, and managed with almost military discipline. If a man dared show weakness or ambition beyond what she allowed, he would be dismissed without hesitation. Catherine was no naive girl. She understood that the greatest danger to an empress was not the poison in a goblet, but the dagger in the heart, often wielded by someone who had once claimed undying love. Among the many men who shared her bed, some became legendary in their own right. Grigory Potemkin was perhaps the most powerful, a brilliant commander who matched her passion with a ferocious, almost spiritual devotion. Together, they forged an alliance that transcended mere sexual attraction, building an unshakable foundation for Catherine's imperial vision. Potemkin became her general, her advisor, and quite possibly her true husband in all but name. Their relationship was a living testament to the strange alchemy of power and desire that had always driven Catherine, a mixture of ruthless practicality and genuine scorching affection. Yet even Potemkin, for all his power, had to accept that Catherine's appetites would not be bound to one man alone. She continued to draw new favorites to her side, testing their loyalty, enjoying their youth and beauty, and discarding them when they no longer satisfied her. It was said that she insisted each lover be physically examined by her ladies-in-waiting to guarantee his vigor, a ritual that became part of the dark mythology swirling around the empress. Europe's pamphleteers and scandalmongers feasted upon these details, twisting them into lurid fantasies that blurred the line between gossip and nightmare. While Catherine's bedroom provided endless fuel for scandal, her mind was occupied with the transformation of Russia. She corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot, hungry for ideas that could modernize her backward, sprawling empire. She reformed the legal system, curbed the worst abuses of serfdom, and expanded education. Under her reign, the arts flourished, and St. Petersburg began to gleam as one of Europe's cultural capitals. Even her most bitter critics had to concede that Russia had never seen a ruler so determined to drag it, willingly or not, into a modern age. Of course, Catherine's benevolent projects were often overshadowed by war. She waged brutal campaigns against the Ottoman Empire, extending Russian dominion deeper into the Black Sea region. Crimea was annexed under her rule, forever changing the balance of power in Eastern Europe. These conquests brought enormous prestige and enormous bloodshed. The Russian army, under generals loyal to Catherine, crushed resistance with pitiless efficiency, and villages burned as the empire's borders expanded. Catherine watched these campaigns with a conqueror's pride, seeing in each province a fresh jewel for her crown, even as her enemies whispered that she had sold her soul for glory. At court, the atmosphere grew ever more extravagant and ever more dangerous. Catherine's passion for men was mirrored by her passion for luxury, banquets that lasted days, diamonds that outshone candlelight, silks imported from Persia and France. Her lovers were dressed like princes, showered with estates and titles, and expected to worship her like a goddess. Yet even as they kneeled before her, some dreamed of becoming more than a passing fancy. Several attempted to leverage their intimacy with the empress into real political influence, but Catherine was merciless with those who overreached. She would break a man's heart as easily as a peasant's rebellion if it threatened her throne. The rumors only grew more extravagant, stoked by Catherine's rivals abroad. Pamphlets smuggled into Russia depicted her as a monstrous harlot, half woman, half beast, whose desires could devour an entire empire. These stories included the infamous lie that she had constructed a mechanical device to satisfy unnatural cravings beyond the capacity of human lovers, a grotesque fantasy that would haunt her legacy for centuries. There was no truth to such tales, yet the world, eager for scandal, embraced them without hesitation. After all, a powerful woman who claimed dominion over men's bodies and men's armies was too terrifying to be accepted without monstrous embellishments. Through all of this, Catherine remained composed, even amused. Her letters often joked about the rumors, mocking the absurdity of Europe's fears while refusing to be shamed. In one famous remark, she compared herself to Caesar. If a man could conquer and indulge, why should a woman be forbidden? It was a sentiment as dangerous as it was bold, a dagger aimed straight at the heart of patriarchal hypocrisy. Catherine saw no contradiction in being both a lover and an empress, both a patron of philosophy and the feared commander of a vast army. That was the contradiction that so scandalized her world, and the contradiction that made her unforgettable. Yet for all her bravado, Catherine could not escape the sense that enemies watched her from every shadow. Plots brewed in dark corners, fostered by those who resented her power, her foreign birth, her unorthodox ways. One day, these enemies would strike, and Catherine knew it. She had stolen a throne, murdered a husband, toppled traditions, and turned a once dutiful wife into a living legend of female supremacy. The price for all of that, she feared, might yet come due. As Catherine's reign advanced into its second decade, the machinery of her empire grew ever more dependent on her personal will. She had learned to rule through the twin forces of charisma and terror, using her iron discipline and fierce intellect to bend the Russian court to her desires. The men who served her in her bed were no longer simply lovers, but instruments of governance. Their loyalty was rewarded with unimaginable riches, but their failure could mean exile, ruin, or even death. Catherine had turned her private passions into a kind of political theater, where pleasure and power were performed in equal measure, night after night, before an audience of envious courtiers. Potemkin, perhaps her greatest love, remained a constant presence even after their affair had cooled. Their bond was deep, beyond the flesh, built on shared ambition and mutual respect. Potemkin directed her armies and shaped her foreign policy, while Catherine maneuvered the treacherous aristocracy with the same skills she had used to conquer the throne. Together, they became the unstoppable engine of Russian dominance, their influence reaching from Poland to Crimea, reshaping the map of Europe in ways that terrified the continent's kings. But Potemkin, too, had to accept Catherine's boundless needs. She took new favorites into her chambers with the regularity of a sovereign collecting tribute, choosing men for their beauty, their conversation, and above all, their obedience. Some lasted mere weeks before they were dismissed. Others found themselves elevated to positions of immense power, only to fall the moment they grew too comfortable. Catherine had no patience for weakness or betrayal, and she knew that her lovers were as capable of treachery as any foreign enemy. Europe, meanwhile, could not turn its eyes away. Her enemies launched constant attacks on her morality, hoping to undermine her legitimacy. The vile rumor about the horse, that she had built some monstrous harness to satisfy her lusts with a stallion, spread across the continent, a symbol of how deeply Catherine had frightened the patriarchs of Europe. This was not simply about her taking lovers. It was about a woman who dared to rule men, a woman who made no apology for her strength or her appetites. She had to be made into a monster to justify the fear she inspired. Yet Catherine refused to shrink. She answered these tales with cutting wit, pointing out that no one questioned Alexander the Great's long train of lovers, or Caesar's countless mistresses. Why then should she, Empress of all the Russias, be held to a standard of chastity designed to keep women powerless? That was the weapon Catherine wielded better than any blade, the fearless defiance of a woman who refused to be broken by shame. In her private moments, Catherine sometimes confided her regrets in letters to close confidants. She spoke of how lonely power could be, how love and politics so easily entangled themselves into something ugly and impossible to trust. She knew that every man she took to her bed measured her not just as a lover, but as a path to power. Even Potemkin, devoted as he was, had ambitions Catherine had to guard against. In her mind, she stood alone on the summit she had conquered, and the winds were cold there, no matter how many warm bodies lay in her arms. The decades rolled forward, and Catherine's legend only grew. She turned her gaze to Poland, partitioning it with the Austrians and Prussians, breaking a centuries-old kingdom apart like a spoiled pastry. She strengthened Russian control over the Black Sea, bringing trade and wealth into her domain while securing naval dominance. Her domestic policies continued to modernize Russian society, from the founding of schools for girls to bold, if imperfect, efforts to curb the cruelties of serfdom. Her contradictions multiplied. She was both liberator and tyrant, reformer and conqueror, a goddess of the Enlightenment and a brutal mistress of empire. Meanwhile, at court, a relentless parade of young men passed through her chambers. Some were chosen for their refinement, others for their strength and beauty, but all were subject to Catherine's exacting expectations. She rewarded them with palaces, jewels, military ranks, and cast them aside with terrifying speed if they disappointed her. In the glittering salons of Europe, these lovers became characters in an ever-expanding myth of Catherine the Insatiable. They were described as slaves to her appetite, playthings who submitted to humiliating whims. The Empress, according to the storytellers, ruled Russia with one hand while caressing a lover with the other, caring for neither God nor law. Catherine's enemies took full advantage of these stories. They saw in her personal indulgence a fatal weakness, a chink in her armor. But Catherine knew that gossip, however vile, was only dangerous if you let it shape you. She refused to let the howls of scandal dictate her destiny. While other monarchs fell victim to rumor and court conspiracy, Catherine held her position for decades, a feat of almost superhuman endurance in a world where queens were usually devoured alive by intrigue. Perhaps it was this impossible durability that shocked Europe most of all. She was supposed to fail a German woman, an usurper, a widow, a harlot, a monstrous parody of a monarch. Instead, she survived. She expanded. She reigned with unstoppable confidence. Her sexual appetite, whether exaggerated or true, was twisted by Europe into a demonic narrative because they could not bear to admit that a woman might rule as a man ruled, taking lovers and empires with the same relentless certainty. Catherine had become the nightmare of every patriarchal order on the continent, the woman who refused to apologize, refused to yield, refused to stop. As the final decades of Catherine's reign unfolded, the contradictions that defined her seemed only to grow sharper. On one side stood the wise, reform-minded monarch, lifting Russia into the modern world with schools, hospitals, and codified laws. On the other side loomed the Empress, whose insatiable desire for fresh conquests, whether territorial or carnal, made her the living embodiment of moral panic across Europe. Her critics obsessed over the stream of young men she elevated, some scarcely more than boys, promoted to ranks and riches far beyond their station because they had pleased her in the night. To the moralists of the West, this was not just an outrage, but a crime against nature itself. Yet Catherine was unrepentant. She had built an empire from the shambles of her husband's failures. She had held that empire together through revolts, invasions, and conspiracies. In her mind, The right to claim her pleasures was as self-evident as the right to command armies. She had bled for the throne, why should she deny herself what lesser men took for granted? But as the years passed, even Catherine's formidable energy began to wane. Her lovers grew ever younger, as though she tried to recapture her own youth through their company, and the court gossips sharpened their knives with every new name added to her list. Some lovers adapted to this dangerous arrangement with remarkable skill. They performed not only in bed, but in Catherine's salons, dazzling with wit, elegance, and political cunning. Those who did not had short, humiliating careers, dismissed and banished once Catherine tired of their failings. The stakes were always high, because a place in the Empress's bed could mean unimaginable riches and power, but it also carried the risk of total ruin. For Catherine, this brutal system seemed fair. She had never claimed to offer love, only favor, and favor could vanish overnight. Meanwhile, the burdens of empire never relented. Across Russia, serfs still labored in miserable conditions. Chained to ancient systems Catherine could only partially reform. Peasant revolts boiled up in fury, demanding a justice she was unwilling or unable to grant. One of the greatest of these rebellions, led by the charismatic Cossack pretender Yemelyan Pugachev, nearly unseated her rule. Claiming to be Peter III returned from the grave, Pugachev roused the serfs with promises of freedom and vengeance against their oppressors. The rebellion surged across the countryside in a tidal wave of violence, shocking Catherine into a cold, unflinching response. She unleashed the full force of her military, crushing the rebels with terrifying brutality. Villages were burned, thousands hanged, entire districts laid waste to remind the empire that no one challenged the empress and lived to tell the tale. Catherine was not blind to the suffering of her peasants. She simply refused to let it threaten her reign. The Pugachev rebellion hardened her heart, and many historians argue it marked the end of any illusions she had about creating a gentler, freer Russia. From that moment on, she would rule as an iron empress, trading mercy for unshakable order. Abroad, Catherine's legend only grew more outlandish. Portraits of her circulated through Europe, portraying a regal, serene woman in a coronation robe, while gutter pamphlets printed vile sketches of her tangled in monstrous orgies or bound to a mechanical horse. These contradictions were impossible for Europe to reconcile. A woman who sponsored Enlightenment thinking, who wrote to philosophers about human dignity and rights, while also indulging a personal life so unashamedly decadent that it made even libertines blush. She was, to them, a walking impossibility, an empress who could not be categorized, and therefore had to be demonized. As she entered her 60s, Catherine's health began to tremble under the weight of so many years of passion and power, yet she refused to slow her pursuits. She still took new favorites, still dined lavishly, still rode out into the grand processions that reminded her people and herself of her glory. There was no place for weakness in Catherine's life. Even as lines deepened on her face and her hair silvered, her eyes stayed sharp and commanding, the eyes of a ruler who had devoured an empire and made it her own. Privately, she sometimes feared what might happen after her death. Would the men she had empowered tear the country apart? Would Russia fall back into the hands of petty tyrants and backward nobles? She tried to secure the future by grooming her son Paul, but their relationship was bitter and complicated. Paul had inherited none of his mother's brilliance and all of her father's instability, and Catherine viewed him with both dread and contempt. It was a tragic twist. The empress who had built an unshakable empire could not trust her own blood to guard its legacy. As night after night passed in the candlelit rooms of the Winter Palace, Catherine's legend continued to throb with the power of half-truths and outright fantasies. She seemed aware that she was being transformed into myth while still alive, that the name Catherine the Great would one day stand for both unbounded power and monstrous lust. She did not fight this legend, because in her mind, myth was stronger than truth. So long as Europe feared her, so long as her people obeyed her, Catherine was content to wear the crown of the nymphomaniac queen, a crown forged in rumors, hardened in blood, and polished by centuries of unrepentant triumph. In the autumn of 1796, the final chapter of Catherine's extraordinary life approached. Though her strength had begun to ebb, she maintained the same regal composure that had carried her across decades of war, reform, and scandal. On a chilly November morning, She was found collapsed on the floor of her private chambers, struck down by a stroke that paralyzed her formidable will as swiftly as any assassin's blade. The woman who had once ruled men and empires with unyielding force was now helpless, a prisoner in her own failing body. Within hours, Catherine the Great, the Empress of all the Russias, was dead. The court was left reeling, for no one had been truly prepared to imagine a Russia without Catherine at its helm. The empire she had built by blood, by brilliance, by passion, now faced an uncertain future in the hands of her resentful son Paul, whose hatred for his mother's legacy burned hot and petty. Catherine had wanted to disinherit him, planning instead to place her beloved grandson on the throne. But death came too quickly for those plans to be carried out. Paul seized power at once, tearing down his mother's favorites, reversing her policies, and denouncing her memory in public while fearing it in private. Yet no amount of royal vengeance could erase what Catherine had achieved. Under her reign, Russia had grown to become one of the greatest powers of Europe, respected and feared from Paris to Constantinople. Her armies had triumphed across battlefields. Her scholars had written new codes of law, and her patronage had lifted Russian culture from a provincial echo of Byzantium into a true rival to the West. Even her harshest critics could not deny that Catherine had seized a kingdom and transformed it with her own indomitable spirit. But the stories that clung to her name, the lovers, the scandals, the monstrous rumors would never die. As word of her death spread, the salons of Europe erupted in sly smiles and crude jokes, reviving every filthy tale ever told about her appetites. Some even whispered that she had died in the act of satisfying her inhuman passions, a lie so grotesque it only revealed how deeply she had terrified those who could not abide a woman's power. Her legend was simply too grand, too dangerous, too rich to ever be tamed by facts alone. And in Russia itself, the people mourned and gossiped in equal measure. They remembered Catherine as the monarch who had brought them victories and prosperity, but also as a woman who had defied every moral stricture they believed sacred. In her, they saw the mirror of an empire itself, bold, brutal, unstoppable, and forever hungry. Even peasants who never saw her in person spoke of Catherine with a blend of awe and fear, telling tales of the empress who had ruled like a man yet burned with a woman's passions beyond any comprehension. In the centuries since, historians have tried to peel back the layers of myth and scandal, searching for the true Catherine beneath the mountain of gossip. They find a brilliant stateswoman, a cunning survivor, and a visionary ruler who shaped the fate of millions. Yet even the most sober scholar cannot fully scrape away the powerful image of the nymphomaniac queen, because in that scandalous, nightmarish legend, there remains a grain of truth. Catherine had wielded her sexuality with the same fearless mastery as she wielded her armies. Where other queens might have hidden behind a veil of virtue, Catherine made her appetites a weapon, blurring forever the line between the sovereign's bed and the sovereign's throne. Perhaps that was why her legacy has proven so irresistible. Catherine's story is more than the rise of a brilliant ruler. It is the story of a woman who dared to live without apology, in an age that demanded women cower and shrink. It is the story of a woman who made no excuses for her needs, her hungers, her ambitions. Her legend endures because it strikes directly at the beating heart of patriarchy, refusing to let any lie fully conquer the truth of her power. In the end, Catherine the Great became something greater than any empress or queen. She became a myth, a cautionary tale, an inspiration, and a nightmare all woven together. Her name still echoes across the centuries, challenging each new generation to ask where the lines are drawn between morality and power, between love and lust, between liberation and tyranny. Her reign proved that a woman could stand alone, could rule alone, could burn through scandal and betrayal like wildfire and still come out triumphant. So remember her not only as the empress who shocked Europe with her appetites, but as the monarch who dared to claim that a woman's passion and a woman's power need not be strangers. In that lesson, more than any conquest, more than any law, Catherine left a legacy that still rattles the world and still dares us to wonder who gets to rule and who gets to love and who decides where one ends and the other begins.